Hey everyone, my name is Matt, and I'm the youth and family pastor at Cornerstone Church in Marshfield, and I'm here today with your Cornerstone Connection, a daily devotional. So I got a fun topic for us today. The topic is this: sin. Sin, but not just sin, confessing our sin. You see, in my devotional today, the recommended reading was Psalm 32. And David writes Psalm 32. In the first 5 verses, he talks about this topic of confessing our sin. And as I read it, I went, man, I got to share this because what David says is so true and so important for the believer. Because if we're honest, too often there is sin in our life, and that's not really the problem. The problem isn't that we have sin in our life. This is going to happen. Sin is going to come. Temptation is going to come. It's going to lead to sin at times. It just is. It's part of our life. But what happens too often is that sin remains and it remains unconfessed. We don't talk to God about it and we don't talk to anybody else about it. And when that is the case, you and I carry a heavy weight. And we may not say we do, but we do. And we carry this guilt. And I love what David tells us today because he opens the curtain to his own life and he's being honest about his own sin, that there was sin in his life. And he was willing eventually to confess it. And he shares with us what that led to and the freedom that it led to. So let me read to you from Psalm 32, verses 1 through 5. Here's what David writes. He says, "Blessed is he whose transgressions are forgiven, whose sins are covered. Blessed is the man whose sin the Lord does not count against him, and in whose spirit is no deceit." He goes on to share his own personal story. "When I kept silent, my bones wasted away through my groaning all day long. For day and night your hand was heavy upon me. My strength was sapped as in the heat of summer. But then I acknowledged my sin to you, and did not cover up my iniquity. I said, I will confess my transgressions to the Lord, and you forgave the guilt of my sin." David starts out in the first two verses, and he talks about how the man or the woman is blessed, whose transgressions are forgiven, whose sins are covered, whose sin the Lord does not count against him or her. And why is he able to say that? Why does David start with that declaration? Well, he starts there because he's remembering back to verses 3 and 4, what he's sharing there, about this time in his life when he had this sin that he was unwilling to confess, that he is unwilling to talk about, and it was weighing down his life. He talks about how his bones were wasting away, how he was groaning all day long. He said it was like as if God's hand was heavy upon him. And isn't this true, you guys? Isn't this true that when there is sin in our life and we just leave it there, when we don't talk about it, we don't acknowledge it, we don't confess it, isn't it true that life is heavy? That we can almost feel crushed? We almost feel like we're wasting away. But then David, remember, he declares we're blessed, though, if we acknowledge it and we confess it. And he goes on to say, in verse 5, he says, I finally acknowledged my sin to you, God. I finally did it. He said, I didn't cover up my iniquities. And I love what he ends with. He says, when I confessed it, he said, you forgave. He didn't say you forgave my sin. He said, you forgave the guilt of my sin. And friends, let that sink in today. Because here's the reality. As you and I confess our sin, yes, our sins are forgiven. But as David says, you forgave the guilt of my sin. This guilt that sin brings with it, that we carry when it remains unconfessed. When we are willing to acknowledge our sin and confess it to God, he doesn't just forgive my sin, he forgives my guilt. He removes the guilt that I am carrying because of the sin that remains unconfessed in my life. So, friend, I don't know where you're at today, and perhaps you have no sin to confess. But if there's sin there, let me challenge you to acknowledge it, to confess it to God, and to allow him to take it from you. Because it's there that you'll receive forgiveness of your sin, and you'll receive forgiveness of the guilt of your sin. And you'll experience freedom. and I desire for you to experience freedom. Have a great day, friends. We'll see you next time on the Cornerstone Connection.